Welcome to Burgundy 101. I'm really actually happy that we have some new faces here because now I get the chance to talk about myself a little more. Just a background for those of you who don't know me. My name is Davis. I started on the PCS team, but now work on the buying team now. But I also do these education classes. And that kind of comes on the background of me having worked in wine production for a number of years between Italy, in the central part of Italy, in a place called Umbria. And after that, I moved out to California, working at two places called Aubert and Diamond Creek before becoming a viticulturist. And then I became a sommelier up in Healdsburg, California, and then here in Westchester at a restaurant called Blue Hill at Stone Barns. But with all of that, we have a bit of a background and kind of a solid foundation for what we're going to be talking about today, which is a region that I get so excited about because the rabbit holes run really deep. We're not going to go down very many of them today, but it's really fun. We're going to be talking about Burgundy, just a bit of an overview here, talking about some historical context, then we'll talk about geography, some climate and grape varieties that you're probably going to see. We're going to do a tasting of two very fun wines today. Then we're going to kind of go into a bit more of a regional breakdown within the larger area of Burgundy. To kick things off, we're talking about a region that is, so we're in France right here. If this is Paris here, we are kind of just maybe 150 miles-ish from Paris. And the idea here is we're kind of in this valley region, as it were, and it's a very interesting place. It wasn't always a big wine area. They say 2,000 years of winemaking has kind of been going on there, but that's not all the way true. So far as our history really establishes Burgundy as like a big winemaking area. The area of Burgundy gets its name, strangely, not from anything French or Roman as much of France is, or even kind of Gaul. That actually comes from the Scandinavians. There's a tiny island off the coast of Sweden called Bornholm, which in kind of very old Swedish translates to like Bergenheimland or something like that. And they traveled all the way down through Germany to this area of what we know now as Eastern France, and established the area as Burgundy. From then on, this area has been a complete trade area, as in many religious and kind of geographical, that is, countries at the time dominated by and moved by religion, were always going through Burgundy because it was Romans trying to get to Bordeaux, or Romans trying to get up to London or Paris, or whatever exchange trade routes there might have been, or even going through the Rhineland as well. And so what ended up happening is, if we take and start with the Swedes coming down into Burgundy, we get this sect of Christianity dominating this area called the Arian Christianity, which then changed to Chalcedonian Catholicism with the Romans coming in very shortly after that to establish Roman Catholicism as the dominant religion, and then Protestantism, and then back to Roman Catholicism. It's this big old wash of religious handoffs. And with that, just as much as we see with different trades in the world, that's how wine grapes found their way into Burgundy. This is kind of really established with kind of the sect of Catholicism that dominates Burgundy through history, which is Cistercian Catholicism. And the reason I bring all of that up is because that's how wine grapes really ended up being established as like the thing for Burgundy. The Cistercians were these incredibly focused viticulturists. They're really meticulous with their farming by way of really caring about sacral wine. And with that, there was a demand for abundance, as this place was such a hot spot for religious trade-off. There was a really great appreciation of these grapevines. And you know, why was it outside of just trade routes that established Burgundy as a hotspot for wine? It was also the geological anomalies. I'm going to show a slide in a second that really excites me, but um, Burgundy is this area that is really well known for having these rolling hills in a valley. And that's why you often see Côte, C-O-T-E, as an expression to describe a region. We have the Côte d'Or, we have the Côte de Nuits, all of this down here is the Côte de Beaune. These are the hills of a place. And these rolling hills are made up of very different expressions of soil. That's because of a bunch of geological events that all happened in a very small stretch of land that has immense diversity. Keep that in mind as we go on. But kind of jumping back into history into like the 1800s, we're going to jump to the French Revolution. So up until this point, the Cistercians and Catholicism and nobility has really ruled the roost in terms of vineyards. It's been families dominating land, a religious cult, a religious sect dominating the land, and what that really did is it centralized a lot of the vineyard holdings. But then Napoleon came around after the French Revolution and established what's called the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code changed French wine law forever. It essentially said that if you have any children, you cannot hand off your vineyard land to only the first son. In other words, no more primogeny. And with that, everything gets divided up equally. So say you are a father and you have 3 kids, your vineyard land now is separated equally amongst all 3 kids. Not by way of, oh, I want this kid to get this plot and this kid to... Every single plot itself is divided up equally into thirds in this case.
And that's
Specific to Burgundy at this time, yes. And it really starts to establish itself later on in the 1930s. So we're talking about, right around the if I'm not mistaken, like 1830s when this happened, the establishment of the Napoleonic Code. 100 years later, after seeing, a couple of you were here with the Bordeaux class last week, after seeing the establishment of the growth system in Bordeaux, mixing this with the Napoleonic Code, there was influence for the AOC establishment. I'm going to talk about that in depth in a minute, and kind of why the establishment of AOCs was so important for Burgundy as we know it today, but keep that in mind for a minute. Last but not least, let's talk about why Burgundy became so famous. It is really boiling down, it's a couple of small things, but one of the biggest things was the train system. Up until kind of the 19th century, or beginning of the 1990s, or 1900s, excuse me, so like the beginning of the 20th century, excuse me, trains had never been seen across this region of France, and with that, shipping regions, so places that were on the coast, did really well for mobility, for wine movement, because they were often seen, and it left behind all the other regions that had no passing routes. The establishment of trains, though, brought Paris to Burgundy by way of trying to get down to Italy, and likewise through Champagne, and it really established Burgundy as this place, okay, I can pass through here, oh my gosh, there's really great wine here, what's going on? And that kind of boils down to, or ends up being the inspiration, rather, for Burgundian farmers to start taking the spotlight. Burgundy is really well known for its farming intensity by way of all of these influences, that is the soil structures, the unique climates, and all of this history that is all condensed into a bottle. You don't see a lot of regions doing it this intensely, and for that reason, Burgundy started to take the limelight in kind of the 1950s, spanning into the 1980s, marketably wise. Last but not least is a fun little anecdote of why you only really see Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in Burgundy, and that's because in the 1390s there was a bishop. Or an edict, excuse me, named Philip the Bold, who at this time you had other grapevines planted around here. It was Pinot Noir and Gamay, as we see grown in Beaujolais now. But this guy, Philip the Bold, said this grape, this disloyal and evil grape, cannot be grown here. It is against the volitions of the religion to be drinking anything other than Pinot Noir. And so he banished Gamay from being grown in all of Burgundy. And that's why we only see Pinot Noir for the most part as the red grape of Burgundy. Then down in Beaujolais, we see Gamay more frequently, and that's just by way of it being banished. This is a little snapshot of the region. Very strangely enough, Chablis is a region that we see in Burgundy. It's much closer to a champagne growing region than it is to the rest of Burgundy. It's very close to the Champagne region of Aube. But here we're maybe about, I don't know, 100 miles from Paris as the crow flies. And then a little farther to the south, we arrive to the Côte d'Or, as it's called, the Golden Coast. It's this whole entire valley that stretches down here from the city of Dijon all the way down to this region here, kind of close to the town of Chalon-en-Seine. But the Côte d'Or is divided into two parts. It's divided from Dijon down to around this area here. We see that kind of maroon area. This is what's called the Côte de Beaune, or the Côte de Nuits, excuse me. Nuits for north, that's how I like to remember it. And then in the south, there's the Côte de Beaune, which kind of starts at that town here of Beaune going down. Then we move on to what's called the Côte Chalonnaise. It's a cooler region. It's kind of south of the Côte d'Or. It's really great value wines. And then below that, we have the Mâconnais, which is a really large region. It's that red-looking region here. The Mâconnais is really unique for me when I think about Burgundy. The most often and kind of common bottle from here, or notable rather, is a place called Puy-Fuissé. It's a really, really great bargain wine, if you ask me, but some really high quality producers make wines from this area. Circling back though to the Côte d'Or, the Côte de Nuits and the Côte de Beaune, and then Chablis rather, these are really where the spotlight is for Burgundy wines. We're talking about wines that have immense fame by names of like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and places up in Chablis like Dovissa or Ramonais. These are wines that the market knows super, super well, and there's a great reason for it. And I'm excited to kind of go into why that is in a moment. Least not forget though, the dishonorable Gamay. That's all the way in the south in the yellow in the area of Beaujolais, where there's a large amount of granitic soil as opposed to in the north where you have some other soil types that are quite abundant. Brief snapshot though of kind of the simplification of the appellation structure in Burgundy. So again, we're back in the 1930s right now, where the Napoleonic Code has started to divide up the land, really diluting things, because at this point in the 1930s, the Napoleonic Code has been established for about 100 years. And with that establishment, it's now been 1, 2, maybe 3 generations of land being passed down. And now if you think about that by following law, it's, okay, say I'm a dad, I have 2 kids. Now each of those 2 kids have half of my dad's holdings. And now each of these guys have 2 kids, and now it's split between 4, and it continues to spread out and dilute. What this ended up doing is it diluted vineyard holdings so much so that there needed to be a unification, because it could no longer be a family. It had to be individuals. And with that, there needed to be something gubernatorially to represent the area writ large. And that was what kind of gave birth to the appellation system. In the 1930s, they kind of had this idea of, okay, we're going to establish a regional demonstration of what these wines are. It's the very base level of where we are. This is kind of half of Burgundian wines. It's just Bourgogne AOC, or Bourgogne Rouge, Bourgogne Blanc. From there, you move up a little bit higher to the village. As we mentioned, as we go up and down the Côte, we have a bunch of little villages popping up. I mentioned a few. There's Beaune, there's Nuits Saint-Georges, even Chablis is considered one of these villages. And in a wine labeled as Beaune AOC or Chablis AOC, these are what are considered a snapshot of the village within which the vineyard site lies. Then from there, within each village, you have what's called a premier cru site. These are the really high quality vineyard sites within a village that give a really dialed in snapshot of what the village really can bring to the table. Last but not least, Grand Cru. This is the creme de la creme, the best vineyard sites of not just a village, but of the region writ large as well. While the Grand Cru vineyards are within a village, oftentimes there are a few villages that don't even get a Grand Cru site. Most notably, there's a village called Nuits Saint-Georges that has no Grand Cru site because the vineyard sites have not been merited that promotion. It's worth mentioning that the promotion between these layers is very, very, very rare, and it doesn't happen on a scheduled basis. In fact, in the Grand Cru level, to my knowledge, it's only happened 2 or 3 times. In 1981 and 1991, there was Clos de Lambray and La Grand Rue that got promoted respectively in 81 and 91. Outside of that, you don't see a lot of promotion there. Just very briefly to move on, there are a few towns worth noting, so a few villages worth noting. The first is Gevrey-Chambertin, and then the second being Vosne-Romanée. The reason I bring these up is because these are the 2 towns with the highest concentration of Grand Cru sites. There are 9 Grand Cru sites in Gevrey-Chambertin and 6 Grand Cru sites in Vosne-Romanée. All of Burgundy has only 33 Grand Cru sites. So half of the Grand Cru sites are split between 2 towns over the whole stretch of the valley, which is substantial. But it's not to diminish the quality of other villages. For example, as I mentioned before, there's Nuits Saint-Georges, which has a vineyard site that has been argued over for years about whether or not it should get promotion. That is the vineyard site of Les Saint-Georges. So it gets very deep and complicated, and it's just worth noting that while something might be labeled Grand Cru, yes, it is an exceptional wine. Premier Cru wines can be phenomenal, as can village wines. A lot of it has to do as well with, as Emily mentioned a minute ago, the holdings owned by the producer. Sometimes a wine might have some grapes coming from a very incredible vineyard site that they just might not say this is representative of the vineyard site, and it might go into a Bourgogne Rouge for that vintage, and you're still getting the fruit from these incredible vineyard sites in a bottling that might be 1/10 of the cost. A small thing worth noting, last but not least, a kind of an asterisk at the village level here, is what they call a lieu-dit wine. This is a vineyard site within a village that is not a premier cru site, but a notable site. It has enough expression to merit it having its own identity on the label. And sometimes you see these lieu-dit wines kind of priced a smidge higher. Interestingly, sometimes a lieu-dit might even be a previously once a premier cru that has now been declassified as a premier cru, and they still want to have the vineyard name on the label so as to have higher marketability for the wines. The Burgundians are business people. Going back to kind of where we are structurally, we're in this long valley, the eastern part of France. Generally, it's a continental climate. It's really cold in the winter. It's warm in the summer. There's a lot of seasonal variation. There's no maritime effect against what we have been talking about in previous regions, and that brings some pretty immense pressures like hail and frost and rain during really important times of the year, especially during harvest. And the frost and the hail come at the worst times of the year because they've been creeping up earlier and earlier in the years. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2021, there was a pretty gnarly, 2020, there's a pretty gnarly hailstorm in Burgundy that knocked out a huge, or hail and frost that knocked out a huge amount of fruit. It's important to note too here that microclimate is kind of going to be the call card for all of Burgundy. I'll get back to that, but keep that in your mind, kind of that intensity based off of where the farmer is and how sharp their viticulture needs to be to give the best expression of that place in the bottle. It's really the idea behind terroir, as we often hear it in Burgundy. Starting with Chablis, we're 100 miles north of the Côte d'Or. It's pretty cool in this area. Wicked cold winters and really short summers, which brings out this electric identity in the Chardonnays. It's 100% Chardonnay. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the soil here is what's called two types of soil. I'll talk about it a little more in a minute. But Portlandian soil, which is limestone clay-based soil, and then Kimmeridgian soil, which is an oyster shell-based soil. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Next, we're going to move on to the Côte de Nuits and the Côte de Beaune, again, what encapsulates the Côte d'Or. At the north, in the Côte de Nuits, just south of the city of Dijon, we have a moderate continental climate. It's a wetter and kind of cooler season just to the north, so easy to remember. But the really unique thing about the Côte de Nuits is its eastern and southeastern facing slope. So if I'm on the Côte d'Or right here, it's eastern, so the mountainsides are facing towards the rising in the east. It's, sorry, that's how I have to remember it. Who doesn't love Beauty and the Beast? So eastern facing slight aspect. So the vineyard sites are facing towards the east and the southeast. What this does is it means that all of the vineyards are only getting sunlight in the morning. That's super important because the morning sun is cooler. And so what ends up happening here is this intense prolonged season that keeps these wines very crisp and cool. These are primarily Pinot Noirs, but it's really protected. It's also surrounded by a lot of forests, and for that reason, it kind of gives this dark fruited character, this firmness that is only emphasized by that morning sun, that cool morning sun. The Côte de Beaune, very different. Not as protected and not southeast and east-facing slope. Instead, it's just plainal and wicked exposed. Here we see a lot more Chardonnay being grown, and it's kind of this fuller-bodied Chardonnay against the Chardonnays that we see coming from Chablis, which again are leaner and more electric. Down in the Côte de Beaune, because it's so much more exposed, a lot more sunlight, and a longer growing season because it has more water retention, not as limestone porous soils, but here a little more clay to hold on to the water. Brings out a lot of ripeness and good phenolic balance, as it's called within the wine. That is, the chemicals within the berries are very, very balanced. There's also a lot of oak to combat that, which you don't always see in Chablis. We're actually going to taste some examples of that very difference that I just mentioned, that is Chablis and, in this case, the Macon, but very close to the Côte de Beaune. Because of what I just mentioned in terms of microclimate, I wanted to point out one Grand Cru site that is a really great example of this. That is a place called Ruchotte-Chambertin. So we're in the village of Gevrey-Chambertin, and this is a vineyard site. We're looking, as you can see here, we're looking east and southeast. This is coming from this part of the property. This is, this photo, this crossroads right here is coming right here, and we are looking down. So this is east, this is south, that's north. And the reason I wanted to point this out is because within this single Grand Cru site, there are three subplots. There's Clos de Ruchot, there's Ruchot de Dessous, and there's Ruchot de Bas. Ruchot de Dessous, as you can see here, is at the top of a hillside, but it's kissing a forest, which means two things. One, in the afternoon, it's going to get shaded earlier than everything else at the bottom of the hill because it's so close to the forest. The sun will set there first. And then last but not least, it's uphill, which means it doesn't hold on to water as much. So with that, there's more shade, so cooler, and less water, which means the vines struggle. In fact, that is what makes Clos de Rochot the most coveted fruit for Rochot-Chambertin, as opposed to Rochot de Bas, which is more saturated soils, more light, and with that, a more ripened berry, not as tension-filled. Talking about the grapes of Burgundy very quickly, we're really talking about one grape that rules the roost, and that's an old grape called Gouais Blanc. Gouais Blanc kind of gave birth to a lot of the wines as we know it in France, not least of which are all of the Burgundian wines as we know them. Even Pinot Noir, as we know it today, is a product of Gouais Blanc. Pinot Noir, which we see right here, is a child between Gouais Blanc here, seldom seen grown anymore. Like I think I've only ever seen it once, but like it's practically extinct. And Pinot. Pinot is named classically because Pinot means pine cone, and it looks like a pine cone. And so that identity kind of trickled out structurally throughout these crosses as we go on. It's worth noting Gouais Blanc, this very high acid wine, kind of neutral in flavor, whereas Pinot is just like this thick-skinned, compact cluster, as we can see there. It's really tight. It's an early ripener. It's sensitive, really sensitive to a site, which is why it is so coveted in Pinot Noir, because Pinot Noir, therefore, as a child of Gouais Blanc and Pinot, ended up being this highly sensitive grape variety. So again, Pinot Noir, highly sensitive. It's very red-fruited. It's floral. It's earthy. It's fine tannins. It's bright and acidic. Then you go to the dishonorable grape, or excuse me, we're forgetting Chardonnay. Then we go to Chardonnay, which again is the same cross of Gouais Blanc and Pinot Noir, and then you see Gouais Blanc and Pinot Noir, Gouais Blanc and Pinot Noir. What ends up happening is, as time goes on, Pinot Noir ends up crossing with Gouais Blanc and creating all of these different expressions of a single cross. That is, one of your children might be blonde hair and blue eyes, and the other kid might have green eyes and brown hair, and then the other one might be a redhead. That's exactly what's happened here. The genetic crossing, even though it's the same two parents, has expressed itself slightly different over time. In Chardonnay, it's this malleable grape variety, cooler climate sensitive. In cooler climates, it can be ripe or crisp and citrus, mineral driven, whereas in warmer climates, a lot more ripe, stone fruited, and a creamy texture, not least of which coming from a lot of the oak integration you see in riper expressions of Chardonnay. Then the dishonorable grape, that is Gamay. It's Pinot Noir against Gouais Blanc again, but in this case, a very juicy grape variety. It's not as tannic as much as it is high acid. It's fresh, it's sensitive to granitic soils specifically. Last but not least, an honorable mention, or two honorable mentions, are Aligoté, this very, very fresh, laser-focused, crisp expression of a white wine. It's only grown in choice regions in Burgundy, but it's starting to become a little more popular. It's highly acidic, citrus-driven. And then last but not least is a wine that comes from Burgundy, but no longer is grown there, and that's Melon de Bourgogne. It's kind of considered like an oyster wine. It's grown in the western reaches of the Loire Valley in the northwest of France, but it's kind of like this really citrus, light, and, briny white wine. On that note, we're going to taste two expressions of a Chardonnay today. Two wines that I think are incredibly special, not just because we're tasting two very high-quality producers today, but we're also tasting two really high-quality vineyard sites. So on your right-hand side is going to be a Grand Cru site from Chablis in the vintage of 2021. This is Le Preuse. And as you'll see in a minute, I'm going to point out to you the differences between some of these different sites. But Le Preuse is a Grand Cru site within Chablis in the north. And this is, again, this area that holds this salty identity. And I want you to think about why that might be as you're tasting these wines. and put that in conjunction against the second wine that you're going to be tasting today. Remembering where we are geographically, climatically, all of these variables and factors that I've mentioned so far. The vintage here is 2021, so very crisp but really stellar year for Chardonnay in Burgundy. White wines from 2021 are considered very high quality for a lot of reasons. And I'll come around with the second wine momentarily from a very notable producer. We're really lucky to be getting to taste this wine today. So the second wine coming from the south in the Côte d'Or, might actually be helpful for me to show you this map just so we have a bit of a snapshot of where we are. First wine is coming from here up in Chablis. The second wine is coming from here down in the Mâcon. This is a producer called Jean-Claude Ramonet. This is a wine that is very special. We're very lucky to be drinking it. So same vintage here, which is the perfect matchup. So 2021 Mâcon, but coming from a sub part of Mâcon called Mâcon Péronne. So Péronne and Mâcon, we're talking about a very exposed place again. We're in the Mâconnais, and this is a wine that for all of the reasons before, we're in the south, more exposed, more sunlight, and for that reason, it's going to have a couple of things that I've mentioned. That creamier texture, that more riper expression, going to be maybe a little less acid-driven. I want you to pay attention to these two differences and let me know your thoughts as you're tasting them. Again, same vintage. Chablis is a region, a sub-region within Burgundy. So Burgundy. Chardonnays are grown in Burgundy. Very specifically, there is an area called Chablis, and there are only Chardonnays grown in this little pink region here in Chablis. Then, in south of the Côte d'Or here, we have the Côte de Beaune, which grows quite a lot of Chardonnay. Then you go down here to the Mâcon, grow a lot of Chardonnay down there as well. You do see some Chardonnays grown up here, but it's a lot less frequent. What do we think about the differences between these two wines? Structurally, acid. Yeah? Tell me more. Tell me more. What do you think about the first wine versus the second wine aromatically?
Definitely more aromatic on the first one.
You think so?
For sure, and maybe a little bit more alcohol nose.
I think that's actually, I think you picked that up. Interesting. Very interesting. I thought the William Fevre was also a little more hot as an expression of alcohol too on the palate. What do we think about the acid structure on the first wine versus the second wine? Linear, as in like 1-to-1? For the first wine? And the second one?
High acidic. I didn't feel it was as acidic.
I totally agree.
I find it a little bit rounded.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more fleshy on the inside.
Mm-hmm. I also think the texture on the second wine is like a lot creamier and a little more toasty. And that's because we're in the south of France, the south of Burgundy. We're in the Mâcon. They're using a ton of oak, if you remember my comment before, because it's a riper area. They love to integrate more oak in this area as a way to combat the ripeness. Whereas up in Chablis, as I mentioned there before, there is a large amount of oyster shell in the soil, and they really love to preserve that and show that off in the glass. And I think, to your point, that's what makes it so linear and laser focused as an acidic expression of Chardonnay. Typically up there too, they're not using as much oak by way of really trying to preserve the crispness, the cool climate that you find in Chablis. Before we dive into Chablis, just a quick snapshot of some basic appellations here. Bourgogne AOC, as you asked a minute ago, Eileen, all of Burgundy, any wine made in this area can be titled as Bourgogne AOC, so long as it meets a couple of regulations. And then last but not least is an honorable mention, that is Cremant de Bourgogne. Cremant is just sparkling wine, de place. So Cremant de Loire, Cremant de Bordeaux, Cremant de la Bourgogne. This is just a sparkling wine of this region. But to your point, let's talk about Chablis. I love Chablis. Chablis is a rabbit hole I could go down for quite a long time, but in the confines of the time we have today, we'll talk about just a couple of things. Here's the town of Chablis, here's the Suresnes, here's the Portlandian soil, and here's the Kimmeridgian soil. Why does that matter? Well, the wines on Portlandian soil, if you were here for the viticulture class, are clay and limestone, whereas the Kimmeridgian soil are limestone and oyster shell fossils. Why does that matter? Well, as you taste it in the prose, that's a super salty and acidic expression of a wine, whereas on the Portlandian soil, it's a really unctuous, kind of a little more broad and riper, because there's more water retention in clay soils. They call those wines Petit Chablis. That's how the designation was given off. They said because they're grown on this soil type, they're going to be titled as Petit Chablis AOC because they are not as expressive of that Kimmeridgian soil that we really want to be known as Chablis AOC. So Chablis AOC, we can understand it's going to be probably closer to or on the opposite side of the River Suresnes, really grounded in that Kimmeridgian salty quality, really steely wines here. No oak generally, maybe a tiny bit. But then we move to the Premier Cru sites. These are the sites kind of going up into the hills on the western side of the River Suresnes. Up as you get up, that's where you really start to see those Kimmeridgian soils starting to pop out into the land. And then last but not least, of course, there's the Chablis Grand Cru. Chablis Grand Cru, kind of confusing. There are 7 Grand Cru sites, arguably 8, but 7 Grand Cru sites, but it's really considered one single Grand Cru with 7 different plots within it. A little confusing, but it's very easy to remember. In Chablis, there's 1 Grand Cru, but there are 7 plots within that Grand Cru. And we are drinking of one of those 7. We're drinking La Preuse right here. And for me, La Preuse happens to be one of these vineyard sites that's at the very top of a hill, and it's really where you're going to get those expressions of that oyster shell coming through more than anything. Next, we're going to talk very briefly about the Côte de Nuits. I've said a couple of names so far. I've said that there are a lot of villages in the Côte de Beaune, in the Côte de Nuits. We can see all of them right here. It is a little complicated, and we're not going to get into those depths today. We're really getting a snapshot of each of these regions. And we're starting at the city of Dijon. We're going all the way down here, right past the town of Nuits Saint-Georges. And we're talking about a region that primarily grows Pinot Noir. Generally, it can't be below 90% Pinot Noir to be considered part of the Côte de Nuits as the regional appellation. That is Côte de Nuits Village, if we're remembering the triangle from before. It's always going to be Pinot Noir here, even though every village might have a different aspect ratio. Some villages might say it has to be 95% Pinot Noir. Some villages it might be 90. It varies. But what is most important here is the difference of soils. Recalling that map again, as we go down the Côte, we have like these weird moments of like these different soil types popping up as the hillsides go along. And if you remember what we're talking about here, we're talking about mountain sites that are looking east and southeast. And so we're looking this way, and we're getting all of these weird, I think this color map actually really, really helps, because it lets you see how at different points, different soil types are coming up, irregardless of the village that corresponds with each of these geographic areas. That's to say, look in Fissan. Then we look in Gevrey-Chambertin, then we go down to Mory-Saint-Denis and Chambolle. These are all these varying soil types popping up in the hillsides that are looking east. What does this do? Well, it creates a lot of geologic and geographic diversity, and it gives birth to these AOCs that we know today. Yes, they are relative to the towns that surround them, but it's very arbitrary in that way. In Gevrey-Chambertin, we're talking about a soil type that is like extraordinarily powerful. It's like the king of Pinot Noir in Burgundy. It's black fruited, it's structured tannins, it's really masculine if you want to use those terms. It's also where the 9 Grand Cru sites of Gevrey-Chambertin are. You'll see them all in this little stretch of red right there. As again, I mentioned earlier, there's that vineyard site, Rochot. I won't go into all of the names here, but if you want to talk about them, I'm happy to. I think it's really interesting to start with Gevrey-Chambertin and then to go to a village that's, adjacent to Gevrey-Chambertin called Chambon-Musigny. If Gevrey-Chambertin is the king, is the most masculine of the Burgundian Pinot Noirs, Chambon is the most feminine. It's finessed, it's light, it's much more diluted, it's not as concentrated. It's very elegant and very finessed. It's soft, and it is home of a very particular Grand Cru site that's only made in very certain vintages. It's called Musigny. It's also home to the only Grand Cru site in all of the Côte de Nuits, so the northern part of the Côte d'Or, that has or allows Chardonnay to be produced. That cuvée is very, very collectible, very sought after, and only 1 or 2 producers, I believe, make it. It's very rare. But the only reason that it is possible to make Chardonnay in the Côte de Nuits, where typically we see Chardonnay growing in either the extreme cold or in the extreme warmth, that is the north and the south of the Côte d'Or, is because Chambon does have that finesse. The soil types and the microclimate allow it to produce a Chardonnay, which you don't see in any other village within the Côte de Nuits. Going down just below Chambon, we have Vougeot, home to the Cistercians. This is kind of like where that religious center was in Vougeot. It's where Clos de Vougeot is. That's the largest Grand Cru site in all of Burgundy, and it is the one that has been cured for so long. That is by way of the Cistercians that arrived in around the year 900. After that, we're going to go to Vosne-Romanée, which is kind of akin to Gevrey-Chambertin in its strength and absolute power. Talking about a lot more structured tannin here, something that drinks on the side of like Coca-Cola in its quality. That's always what I think of when I'm drinking VR or Vosne-Romanée. This is where notable producers live, like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. You're thinking about vineyard sites called Richebourg, Echezeaux, Latache. It's this very velvety and kind of regal style of a Pinot Noir, whereas Gevrey-Chambertin might be this more rustic and kind of brooding style of a masculine Pinot Noir. And last but not least, is honorable mention here is Nuits Saint-Georges, where there are no Grand Cru sites, but there is a very particular identity of these wines. It's this sturdiness and probably the most rustic or forest-driven style of a Pinot Noir in Burgundy. Last but not least, we have arrived to our friends in the Côte de Beaune. Man, there are a lot more towns in this part of the valley, and it gets a lot more complicated because they aren't just growing Pinot Noir. They're growing both Pinot Noir and Chardonnay across the board. It's primarily Chardonnay, but there are a couple of really important examples of Pinot Noir. Starting with the area at the north in the village of Alox-Corton, there's a very famous vineyard site called Corton. We see another expression of this very rich and saturated type of Pinot Noir, akin to that Coca-Cola style. Outside of that, in the town of Beaune and Pommard and Volnay, we also see these really more finessed and iodine-driven styles of Pinot Noir, and that's because that granitic soil is starting to find its way to the surface here, giving a very distinct identity against that of the Pinot Noirs coming from the Côte de Nuits. As I mentioned, though, before, we are in Chardonnay land, but we're a lot more exposed. You can see that by way of the soil types being a little more uniform here. That is to say, we're not getting a lot of variation demonstrated in the Grand Cru, Premier Cru, or Village separations here, and that's because this area is a lot more flat and exposed. With that said, very specifically talking about Alox-Corton, as I mentioned before, there's the Corton Grand Cru. It's the largest Grand Cru in all of Burgundy, next to Clos de Vougeot. It's all whites, bottled under a very, the most coveted label in this region called Corton Charlemagne. It's this very opulent and stylish expression of Chardonnay, whereas the Pinot Noirs from Corton are a little more Coca-Cola driven, as I mentioned before. In Beaune, it's the capital of the region. It's where there's the most famous auction, arguably, for wine annually, called the Hospice de Beaune. It is a charity auction that's to be donating the proceeds to the local hospital, but it's where all of these amazing Burgundian wines are, not all of, but a large portion of these very specific vineyard sites are auctioned off in barrel as opposed to in bottle, so allowing the winemaker to perhaps get in the way there. A very good example of a négociant in this way, because the winemakers are not the people who purchased or grew this fruit. Therefore, all of the labels for Hospice de Beaune would be a négociant label. Then we move down to Pommard. It's the real identity for red wine. It's iodine-driven wines. I often mistaken this wine in a blind tasting to be Grenache, and that's because of how unique this style of Pinot Noir is. It dilutes the tannin quality. The alcohols tend to be a bit higher because it's a bit warmer, but the granite soils start to confuse you. That's my rationalization for my mistakes, but it's also this place that has a lot stranger texture because, again, we're not in the cooler north, which creates this tension. We're a little farther in the south. It's riper. Moving down to Volnay, it's this area that is only making red wines, strangely enough, but they're lighter in quality. It's kind of the halfway point between Chambon-Musigny and Pommard, using that granite soil, but because it's a bit cooler, we're also getting this finesse and lightness. There are no Grand Crus there, but in Volnay, strangely enough, there are white wines being grown, but they are not allowed to be. This is where like the Burgundian rabbit holes start, so I'll stop after this comment, but the white wines in Volnay, grown in the village of Volnay, are labeled under Meursault because there is no marketability historically, nor does the government regulation allow for Chardonnay to be grown in the AOC of Volnay. It gets weird like that, and it gets really weird as you go on farther down, specifically in the area around Meursault. No Grand Crus in Meursault, but very unique, rich identity. It's nutty, it's slightly herbaceous in green. It's a whole cluster expression of Chardonnay as the style here to really add to that texture, which we started to see in this Macon from Ramenais. That is to say, as you're going south, you're really starting to try to integrate as much herbaceousness and ripeness as you possibly can to offset the concentration that these wines start to have because of the lack of cool climate that we might have seen, for example, in the William Febvre. Some high quality vineyard sites here come to my mind, like Le Perrier. Really, really wonderful wines there. But the idea really behind that is these wines, as you get to the south, is to combat ripeness with oak. Speaking of, let's talk about probably the most well-known name in the Côte de Beaune. That is the M word. There are a couple of vineyard villages surrounding Montrachet. That is the vineyard site, and that's Pouligny and Chassagne. But these two vineyard villages couldn't be more different, if you ask me. Pouligny-Montrachet takes its name naturally from the famous Montrachet vineyard site. It's racier, it's mineral and bitey in character. Pouligny is this wine that snaps at you like maybe a defensive dog would. That's how I think about Pouligny-Montrachet. Whereas Chassagne is lush and it's full of tension. It's a little more oak-driven, and it's a tear between the minerality of, this tear away from the minerality that we do find in Chablis and Pouligny-Montrachet. And last but not least, the vineyard site of Montrachet, which is that kind of Goldilocks principle, finding that perfect balance between Pouligny and Chassagne. And that is all I had for you guys today.